Hey everyone, welcome back to my channel. My name is Kari, and today I thought that we could see what are the best and worst books that I've ever read according to Goodreads. So this isn't a new video concept. I'm gonna link some creators down in the description box that I've watched their version of this video and really enjoyed it, so you should definitely check them out as well. I will say that I'm only gonna talk about books that have at least 5,000 reviews on Goodreads, otherwise I feel like that kind of skews the data. So I think we should start with the supposedly worst books that I've ever read. And the order I'll go in is from least worst to most worst, if that makes any sense. So the least worst of the worst books I've ever read is Frome by Edith Wharton. So this is a classic that was recommended for people who enjoy Wuthering Heights, which I love Wuthering Heights, it's one of my favorite books. So I felt like I was obliged to read this. So the Goodreads rating for Frome is 3.42. Personally, I rated this 3 stars, so I would say Goodreads and I are on the same page about Frome. It was fine, but if it had been any longer than what it is, I think it's like 100 pages, I'm sure that it would have gotten an even lower rating from me. Also, the ending is just horrible. And not that I don't like horrible endings, I love horrible endings. It was just very anticlimactic, I feel like. If you've read this, you know what I mean. The next worst book that I've ever read is The Silent Wife by A.S.A. Harrison. To be honest with you, I remember literally nothing about this book, so that should tell you a lot. All I know for sure is that this is a thriller, and I don't remember anything more than that. So the Goodreads rating for this is 3.31, and I rated it a 3 stars. So again, Goodreads and I are on the same page. Next we have Exciting Times by Dolan. So just the fact that this book is on the worst books that I've read according to Goodreads, I'm gonna have a problem. So the Goodreads review is 3.28. I gave this a 4.5 stars. This book is so good. This is literary fiction and it follows Ava, who is Irish, and she moves to Hong Kong to be an English teacher. And Ava ends up meeting and kind of dating this banker Julian, but she starts to develop more feelings for him than he has for her. And in the meantime, Ava meets somebody else, so it's about her struggling between these two people that she has feelings for. Now that sounds like it's a romantic story, but the focus really isn't on the romance so much. This book is so funny. Dolan's writing is impeccable. I'm really looking forward to Dolan releasing another book because I love this one so much, and I'm sure I'm gonna love whatever she releases next. A lot of people compare Dolan to Sally Rooney because they're both Irish and they're both writing literary fiction, and I would agree with that they're quite similar. If you like Sally Rooney, I think you would like Exciting Times. All that to say, I'm really angry that this is on the worst books that I've ever read according to Goodreads. That's definitely not true. I love this book. Next we have A Simple Favor by Darcey Bell. This one is a thriller, and you might recognize the name because it was turned into a movie with Anna Kendrick and Blake Lively, but the movie actually changed the ending, so if you're interested in hearing like the original ending, I would recommend reading the book. So this has a 3.28 on Goodreads, and I gave it a 4.5. Now it has to be said that I gave this a 4.5 because I read it in one sitting. It doesn't necessarily mean that I thought it was this extravagant book, but it made me want to keep turning the pages despite being kind of ridiculous at times, so I kind of gave it credit for that. I guess I understand why this rating was so low. I mean, it is kind of ridiculous at times, but it's still a fun read. Okay, we're only 5 away from the worst book I've ever read, and the next one is Madam by Phoebe Wynne. Now, if you've seen my most recent video where I talk about books that are set at school to get you in the back to school mood, I already waxed poetic about Madam, so I am mad that this is on this list. So this is a 3.26, and why? It's so good. Personally, I gave this a 4.25, which is a whole point more than Goodreads gave it. So this is a dark academia book where they hire a new classics teacher, and she's the first new teacher in 10 years at this school. The school is really prestigious and it's only girls that go there. The teacher starts to get the vibe that something's not quite right at this school, and she starts to wonder if she made a mistake agreeing to work here. I would really recommend this book. Don't let the bad Goodreads rating deter you from it. It's so good. Next we have The Death of Jane Lawrence by Caitlin Starling. This has a 3.2 on Goodreads, and that is generous. For the first time ever, Goodreads is being generous with their ratings. Despite how much I freaking love this cover, this book was not for me. So this is a gothic story, and I read it in October last year to get in the spooky season, you know? But it is so bad. I wanted to love it so badly, but I just couldn't. I kind of can't believe that Goodreads has a 3.2 for this because that is just super generous. Next is another classic, and it's actually one of the first gothic stories to ever be written, and that's The Castle of Otranto by Horace Walpole. So this has a 3.18 on Goodreads, and personally I gave this a 2 stars. I read this for Halloween 2 years ago, and I didn't go into it expecting to love it. I really just wanted to read one of the original gothic stories to ever be written, so it was more for like educational purposes that I read this, so it's kind of my own fault that I didn't enjoy it. But if you're interested in gothic literature, this is still something worth reading because, like I said, it's really important to the genre. And now for for the third to worst book that I've ever read is Insatiable by Daisy Buchanan. So this has a 3.14 and I gave it a 2-star. So again, Goodreads is being quite generous on the rating. I picked this up because it was being compared to Sally Rooney and Naoise Dolan, which like I said before, I love both of those authors. But that was a very kind comparison because this does not live up to like Conversations with Friends or Exciting Times. Next is a book that I read fairly recently, and that's We Had to Remove This Post by Hanna Bervoets. And this is translated from the Dutch by Emma Rout. So if you saw my recent reads wrap up, you'll know that I loved this book. I thought it was incredible. So the fact that this is the second worst book that I've supposedly read, that's inaccurate. This has a 3.08 on Goodreads. Like, why? But I gave this one 4.5 stars. I really loved it. So this is about Kaylee, who's a young woman who gets a job at this social media network. It's basically like Facebook, and she and her colleagues are in charge of removing posts that go against the community guidelines. So, you know, for violence or sexual content or things like that. But this story examines how does looking at all these horrible things all day affect someone mentally. It's such a good book, and I found it fascinating to see how someone can be affected by looking at all these horrible things all day, because I never considered that before, that actual people have to take down these horrible things on social media every day. I do think that this book was marketed as horror, and I don't know if it's necessarily horror. I mean, the things that she's seeing online are sometimes horror, but this story itself I don't think should be considered horror. So maybe people had different expectations going into this and that caused them to rate it lower. I'm not sure. I would definitely recommend this if it sounds interesting to you. And the worst book that I've ever read, according to Goodreads, is Things Have Gotten Worse Since We Last Spoke by Larocca. So already from the cover you can tell that this is a weird ass book. Goodreads gave this a 3.05, which is not great. And personally, I gave it a 3.5 because I thought it was okay. So this one is definitely a horror book. And I feel like people being grossed out by this book could potentially affect people's reviews, like they thought it was so gross so they rated it low, when in reality they should have known that that's what they were signing up for. I don't know. Basically, this one is set in the early 2000s and these two women meet in an online chat room. One of the women is selling this apple peeler to the other one, and things start to get weirder and weirder between the two of them. So we read this story through AIM messages and emails. So one of the reasons I picked this up because it's really nostalgic for people who used AIM, and I think it's pretty good for people who appreciate a good horror story. So after going through all these books that Goodreads has claimed are the worst books I've ever read, do I agree that this is the worst book I've ever read? Absolutely not. I've absolutely read things that I thought were worse than this. I do not agree that this is the worst thing I've ever read. But they did get kind of close because The Death of Jane Lawrence is one of the worst books I've ever read. So it was kind of close on that one. So next, let's see what are the best books I've ever read. We can end on a positive note. So again, I'll go from the least best to the best best. So first we have the first book that I read in 2022, and that's A Little Life by Hanya Yanagihara. So Goodreads has given this a 4.33, and personally, I gave this 5 stars. So I assume since you watch videos about books, you've already seen people talk about A Little Life and know a little bit of what it's about. But basically, this follows the main character Jude, who has lived some really traumatic things in his life, and this story flashes back and forth to piece together the puzzles of Jude's life and what has happened to him. It's very, very sad, as the cover would suggest. Everybody freaking cries when they read this book. There's vlogs all over BookTube of people reading this for the first time and crying their eyes out. I do have to mention, make sure you check for content warnings before you jump into this book. But when it comes to this rating, 4.33, I feel like that could be even higher, but there are a good amount of people who don't like this book because they feel like it's sad just to be sad. And so those people probably rate it really low, and that's preventing the Goodreads rating from being even higher, because personally, I think this book is a masterpiece. Hanya Yanagihara's writing is stunning. If you've been hesitating to read this book, first check the content warnings and make sure you're okay there, but if you're okay with it, I would definitely recommend reading this book. It's one of my favorite books of all time now. Next we have Persepolis by Marjane Satrapi. So this is actually a memoir in graphic novel form. Goodreads has rated this 4.37, and personally I gave this 5 stars. So this memoir graphic novel is for adults, and it follows Marjane growing up in Iran during the Iranian Revolution. So as someone who never learned about the Iranian Revolution in school, I found this really educational. So it follows her childhood in Iran, but also her moving to France, which I live in France, so I appreciated that part of the story too, and she still lives in Paris today. If you've never read a graphic novel before and you're interested in it, like I said, this is the first graphic novel I had ever read. I would really recommend starting with Persepolis. This was incredible. Again, I feel like the rating should be higher than 4.37 for Persepolis. It's so good. Next we have The Fellowship of the Ring by J.R.R. Tolkien. So Goodreads has rated this 4.38, and personally I give this 3 stars. Tolkien fans, please don't come for me. I wanted to to love this so badly. Truly, I did. I read The Hobbit before this and I absolutely fell in love with it. It became one of my favorite books of all time. And so I really had high expectations for The Fellowship of the Ring. I wanted it to become a favorite as well. I just felt like there was a big chunk where nothing really adventurous happens, and I got a little bit bored from time to time. But like I said, I was desperate to love this book. I wanted to love it so badly. I am looking forward to reading The Two Towers because I hope I love it more than I love The Fellowship. But I know that this book is super well loved, and the Goodreads rating shows that, 4.38. I mean, people love this book. I do love the movie adaptation of this book though. The next best book that I read is Atomic Habits by James Clear. So this is a nonfiction about creating habits. I won't go into too much detail about this one, but on Goodreads it has a 4.38. I read this over 3 years ago, and to be honest with you, I remember literally nothing about it, but at the time I must have appreciated it because I gave it 5 stars. I don't know if my rating would be so high if I reread it again today, but I do know that I read this book because I wanted to make reading a habit, and we see where I am today, so it must be a good book if it helped me become such a big reader. Next is actually a book from a series, from the A Song of Ice and Fire series, aka the Game of Thrones books, and that's A Clash of Kings by J.R.R. Martin. So Goodreads has rated this 4.41 stars. Personally, I gave it 5 stars. It's amazing. I can't tell you about it because it's book number 2 in a series, but if you've seen Game of Thrones, book 2 has inspired season 2 of the show, even though there are some pretty big differences between the two. So while 4.41 is a pretty good rating, it should be higher than that because this book is incredible. Next is another nonfiction, and it's Catch and Kill by Ronan Farrow. So this also has a 4.41 stars, and I gave it 5 stars. I actually talked about this one a lot in a video that I made about my favorite nonfiction books of all time, which I'll link down below if you're interested in watching that. This book is really, really good if you're interested in learning more about the Weinstein case, but it's also just interesting to read about how journalism works. So if you're interested in reading about how journalism works in general, I would still recommend this book for that. Next is a book from a series that of course is going to be on the list of top books on Goodreads, and that's Harry Potter and the Chamber of Secrets. This is my Jim K illustrated edition, which I absolutely love because Jim K's illustrations are beautiful. So this has a 4.43 star rating on Goodreads, and I gave it a 5 stars. Next we have the first book in the A Song of Ice and Fire series, aka Game of Thrones series, and that's A Game of Thrones by J.R.R. Martin. This has a 4.44 rating on Goodreads, and I gave it a 5 stars. So like I said, this is book 1 in this series, and it's very similar to the first season of the show, whereas book 2 and season 2 are a bit more different. I'm not a huge fantasy reader, but after watching the Game of Thrones series, I really wanted to read the books that inspired the show, and so this year I've been reading them, and I've absolutely fallen in love with the book series. Even if you've watched the show, I would definitely recommend reading the books because you get so much more information. Even though so far what I've read, a lot of the big moments are the same as the big moments in the show, there are so many other little details that are different, and we find out so much more information, like the motivations of why people do the things that they do, that we really don't get in the show. Also, it's just really fun to see what are all the differences between the book and the show. Would highly recommend this series. Next is another nonfiction, and it's Educated by Tara Westover. This has a 4.47 on Goodreads, and I gave it a 5 stars. I've actually already talked a lot about this book. I talked about it in my favorite nonfiction book video, and also last week in my back to school books. So if you're interested in hearing more about this book, I'll link those 2 videos down below. But I would definitely agree that this is one of the best nonfiction books I've ever read. Next is the first book in the Harry Potter series, and that's Harry Potter and the Sorcerer's Stone. Now my edition says Philosopher's Stone because I got the UK edition since I'm in France, but it's Sorcerer's Stone in my heart as an American. Anyway, again, this is the Jim K illustrated edition. It's beautiful. I would really recommend these editions. This has a 4.47 on Goodreads, and I gave it a 5 stars. So we're getting closer and closer to the best books I've ever read, and again we have a nonfiction, which I'm pretty surprised that there's so many nonfiction in the best books I've ever read. Well, according to Goodreads. So next we have Born a Crime by Trevor Noah. So Trevor Noah is a comedian, and he's the host of The Daily Show. This has a 4.48 on Goodreads, and I give it a 5 stars. Yet again, this is another nonfiction that I talked about in my favorite nonfiction books of all time. So clearly I'm agreeing with Goodreads here on these nonfiction choices, that I agree they are some of the best books I've ever read, especially if we're talking about nonfiction. I would recommend this book even if you're not even like a huge fan of Trevor Noah or don't even know who he is, because it's a really interesting story about growing up in South Africa. Next is the book that I actually just finished 2 days ago, and that's the third book in the A Song of Ice and Fire series, aka the Game of Thrones series, A Storm of Swords by J.R.R. Martin. This has a 4.54 on Goodreads, and I gave it a 5 stars. So I've only read the first 3 books in this series, so I'm not sure where the next 2 books would fall on this list if I had read them, but I think it's interesting that this is book 3 and it's rated the highest of all the books so far. I would guess that that means that if you're continuing in a series and you get to book 3, you're obviously loving it, so of course you're going to rate it pretty well. I'm assuming that that's what's happening here. So anyway, I'm agreeing with Goodreads that this deserves a really good rating. This book was incredible, and I can't wait to continue in the series. Next is another graphic novel, and that's Mouse by Art Spiegelman. This has a 4.55 on Goodreads, and I gave it a 4.5, so I think that that's the first time that Goodreads and I had the exact same rating. So this is another memoir graphic novel that I would recommend if you're looking to get into graphic novels as an adult. So this is about the author Art Spiegelman, who's learning about his parents who survived the Holocaust. This is a really excellent story and I would recommend it. Next is the 4th book in the Harry Potter series, and that's Harry Potter and the Goblet of Fire. This has a 4.57 on Goodreads and I gave it a 5 stars. So the third from the best book that I've ever read according to Goodreads is Harry Potter and the Prisoner of Azkaban, which is obviously the 3rd book in the Harry Potter series, and this has a 4.58 on Goodreads and I gave it a 5 stars. So this is actually the last fiction book on my list, and so do I agree with Goodreads that this is the best fiction book that I've ever read? No. While this has a lot of nostalgia for me, today as an adult, I would not say that this is the best fiction I've ever read, and it's not even my favorite Harry Potter, so I don't necessarily agree with Goodreads on that one, even though I love this book, obviously. I just wouldn't say that it's my favorite fiction book, nor even my favorite Harry Potter book. And the second to best book that I've ever read according to Goodreads is one that I just recently listened to the audiobook for, and that's I'm Glad My Mom Died by Jeanette McCurdy. So the entire internet has been reading this book, and like the physical copy of it sold out like instantly and no one could get a physical copy of it, so I listened to it on audiobook. And I'll talk more about my thoughts when I do my recent reads wrap up, but this one has a 4.7 rating on Goodreads already, and I gave it a 5 stars. It's very, very good. Even if you have no idea who Jeanette McCurdy is, I would still recommend this book. It's so good. And finally, the best book that I've ever read according to Goodreads is Know My Name by Chanel Miller. This has a 4.72 rating on Goodreads, and there's like almost 150,000 reviews of this. So this is a really well-loved nonfiction book. Personally, I gave it 5 stars. It's one of the best nonfiction books I've ever read. So again, you'll find this in my video of my favorite nonfiction books. So this is about Chanel Miller, who was sexually assaulted on a university campus, and the repercussions that it had on her life and her family, and also the trial that came afterwards. It's a truly excellent read, very, very powerful. I can only recommend this book. It's amazing. I do agree with Goodreads that this is one of the best books that I've ever read, especially if we're talking about nonfiction. It probably is the best nonfiction book that I've ever read. So after all that, can we say that we can trust Goodreads reviews? I would say for the most part, if Goodreads says that a book is very good, you can probably assume that it is going to be really good. However, for the books that they say are bad, I would not take that into account. If Goodreads says that it has a low rating, I wouldn't take that too seriously, because some of my favorite books that I've ever read are some of the worst books according to Goodreads that I've ever read. So if I had judged them based on the Goodreads rating, I would have never discovered these books that are some of my favorite of all time. So I think that that's something to keep in mind. Don't be deterred from a book if it has a low rating on Goodreads. It might be a hidden gem. I would love to know what some of your supposedly best and worst books are according to Goodreads, and do you agree that they are some of the best and worst books that you've ever read? Or were they like mine, where some of your favorite books have a really bad rating? So let me know that in the comments. I would love to see some more perspectives on that. If you like this video, please like it. I would really, really appreciate it. And if you haven't subscribed already, I would love it if you did. I would love to have you back. And I'll talk to you again next time. Bye!